I know we have a lot to cover today, so I will just make a few quick points about where we're at with respect to the fourth report and order and third order on reconsideration. Revisions to Section 74-1232D of the rules, which basically allow translator applications that are granted to be used as cross-service translators, became effective on May 9th. As to the remaining parts of the order, basically those portions of the order relating to the caps and the amendment processes will become effective upon OMB approval. We're currently working our way through that process, and we anticipate approval sometime by late June. Jim will be getting into the substance of those processes in a few minutes. And in terms of petitions for reconsideration, we do have 4 that have been filed. Against mostly the one per market and the national caps. We will be putting together a Federal Register notice of that, and once it's published, it will establish the pleading cycle with respect to oppositions and replies. That's all I have.
I'm Tom Hutton. I'm Deputy Chief of the Division. I want to address the 5th report and order and 4th further notice of proposed rulemaking. That was released on March 19th, the same date we released the 4th report and order. The 5th report and order followed the Local Community Radio Act by eliminating the third adjacent channel protection for LPFM stations, except for those that are in border areas that are subject to international requirements for third adjacent protection. The 5th report and order also retained the rule, it's in section 73.807A2 and B2 of our rules, requiring higher protection of radio reading services for the blind on FM subcarrier frequencies existing as of September 20th, 2000. We received a number of questions in advance of this forum about our LPFM interference standards, which will have to be revised pursuant to the Local Community Radio Act. Those standards are currently under review in that rulemaking. We've received about 1,500 comments already, and reply comments are due on May 21st. We issued the tentative conclusion with respect to second adjacent channel waivers that the LPFM applicant will have to show that there will be no interference to any authorized radio service. With respect to third adjacent channel protection, we proposed 2 different procedures of complaints and remediations. One for fully spaced third adjacent channels under our past standard, and one for short spaced third adjacent channels under our past standard. Both of these go beyond our past practice in the LPFM area. The protection obligations for a fully spaced LPFM station will be similar to the current rule that FM translators are subject to, which is in section 74.1203 of the rules. The obligations for the short spaced third adjacent LPFM stations will also include the requirement for periodic broadcast announcements about the potential for interference for a period of 1 year after the station is constructed, and then notification within 48 hours to the Commission and any affected stations about any interference complaints. The fourth further notice of proposed rulemaking also addresses the issue of LPFM power levels, a very significant issue for us. It tentatively proposed eliminating the LP10 class. There's never been an LP10 LPFM station authorized by the Commission. It also proposed adding LP250, 250 watt stations outside of urban areas. For those who are planning to comment on this issue, I would suggest that they take a look at the Media Bureau's economic study of LPFM stations released on January 5th, 2012. I think that study is probably the single best analysis that's out there about the viability of LPFM stations that are currently at the level of 100 watts and the issues that they face in operating with 100 watts of power. We're also looking at the possibility of cross-ownership of FM translators with LPFM stations. Again, I think that's a very significant issue. I'm looking forward to going through the comments on that one. And then we propose a point system for deciding among competing LPFM applicants. In format, it'll be similar to the current system we have for non-commercial educational comparative selections. We don't have a specific target date for a sixth report and order establishing these revised LPFM rules, but it is a high priority for us. We've already started reviewing the initial round of comments, and we look forward to going through the reply comments. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to talk for a minute on the caps. First, I want to apologize to Charles Cooper, who I call Charles Crawford. If those of you who follow our releases know, Charles Crawford is a regular filer in the audio division, but not nearly as distinguished as Charles Cooper. So I'm sorry about that. In any event, just briefly, the order does establish a cap of 50 applications per applicant. For us, applicant means applicant. We're not concerned if an individual may hold attributable interests in more than one applicant. We also had a market cap of one application per applicant in 156 studied markets. Those markets changed slightly from the NPRM. It's these markets that count. It's the 150 largest markets, plus any market where more than 4 translator applications were pending. The order defines a translator application as being in a market if the transmitter site is located within the geographic boundaries of the Arbitron market. In applying the cap, we will take into account both pending long-form applications that have been frozen for quite some time, plus all the 6,500 short-form applications. As Kelly mentioned, we're hoping for PRA approval in late June. We will be releasing a public notice tomorrow announcing the filing of the petitions for reconsideration. And as Kelly said, as soon as we get that in the Federal Register, we'll get the 15 and 10-day cycles for oppositions and replies going. It is our plan to issue an order on reconsideration on a expedited basis, certainly to forward our recommendations to the Commission on that basis. At this point, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Jim Bradshaw, who with Jordan Bryn and Gary Loers are really the masterminds of our market-specific processing methodology. I think they've done a remarkable job giving us a meaningful understanding of the remaining low-power licensing opportunities in major markets. And the first time I think we've really ever had such a complete understanding. And I think they've shown us a way with these processing rules for us to faithfully implement the directions Congress has given us in the LCRA. So with that, Jim is going to take over for the rest of the show.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks everybody for coming. Just wanted to thank particularly AFC and Charles Cooper. Charles has been actually contacting me pretty much since the week the item was adopted to host a forum like this, and I've come to discover that it's definitely going to be hopefully a very helpful thing for everybody included. So I'd really like to thank Charles and AFC's involvement in making this happen, and also David O'Connor and FCBA for helping make this happen too. It's good to see all of you here today, by the way. It's hopefully we have many folks on the web watching too. I'd like to just second what Peter said about all the folks within the division that have been involved getting us to this point. Jordan Bryn and Gary's involvement in particularly getting the grid tool updated and out to the public was most helpful. Could not have done it without them. Also, Edna Prado and Larry Hanifali have been very helpful in getting ready for this presentation, and just their support and other related low power and FM translator issues. So thank you all. Okay, a little background about the fourth report and order. In order to faithfully implement the LCRA and to preserve the limited LPFM opportunities in the larger markets, the Commission made decisions about the pending FM translator applications in these top 150 markets and 6 other markets based on, among other things, the existing LPFM stations within the 30 by 30 minute grids or 20 by 20 minute grids in some cases, available LPFM channels that could be allotted in those grids. These analyses were centered at the major cities within each market, and the grid points of these analyses represent likely the last opportunities for LPFM stations to provide service within these markets. So with the analysis performed in the fourth report and order, we had these 156 markets which were categorized as either spectrum limited markets or spectrum available markets. Spectrum available are those markets that deemed to have an adequate supply of LPFM availability, and spectrum limited markets are those with minimal or no opportunities. And those thresholds were all determined by the Commission. They're referred to as channel floors, and there are different floors for markets 1 to 20, 21 to 50, 50 to 100, and 100 and above. And so basically the focus of the rest of the presentation today is going to be how we both preserve these remaining LPFM opportunities and also allow for the most expedient processing of the remaining translator applications. Okay, so the grid tool. We put out a public notice at the end of April releasing the grid tool. The link to the tool itself or the package for the tool is right here on the slide. The DA number is on here too if you want to access it that way. This includes updated code from the code that was previously released in 2011. There were some comments in the proceeding about some shortcomings with the code and how it worked. We've tried to resolve as many of those as possible. Some of the known issues were failure to properly exclude points in what we refer to as water cities. I'll get to that in a minute. And just generally tightened up the code. The package also includes the March 2012 data file, which is the file that was used to assemble all of the channel availabilities in Appendix A and B in the report and order. Another important inclusion is an Excel file that has the city center coordinates that were used for each of these 156 markets. The README file is necessary for anybody who intends to use this grid tool. The README file includes any of the details you need to know as far as how to download, the data files you need to execute it, how to save it in a particular directory, and just general information about using and getting the best information from the grid tool. It also includes other necessary code and data files. And so the tool can be used to assess the viability of FM translator applications in spectrum limited and spectrum available markets. And I'm going to get to that detail in a minute. But basically, in a nutshell, you have to download this whole package, you unzip it into a directory, and in 5 or 10 minutes you can be up and running with the tool. One thing I want to note is we have provided this tool for users' convenience, for your convenience. You are under absolutely no obligation to use this tool, and I'm sure there are other people out there that would. Well, in fact, I know there are other people out there that are trying to design their own tools so they can just use their own tools internally. But you do not have to use the tool. We expect to use the tool internally, and I'm going to show you how we're going to do that. But if you care to devise your own methods, have at it. A little bit about how the tool works. It requires several inputs, and I'm going to talk generally about the tool, and then later in the presentation I'm going to tell you exactly how it's used to get to these bottom line answers that you need to process translators. So the tool requires several inputs. The city and coordinates are critical for proper exclusion of points in oceans, major bodies of water, points outside the U.S. If you do not specify the exact coordinates and the exact city name and state abbreviation the way it's spelled in the market name or spelled in the Excel file, you will not get proper exclusion of points. So, for example, it may tell you that there are low-power FM points available in the Atlantic Ocean. Just one example of how it can give you an incorrect answer if you don't input those things correctly. It also allows you to select the protection options. So the tool is used to assess low-power points in the grid. So in assessing those points, you can include or exclude co- and first adjacent stations, second adjacent stations, third adjacent stations, IF space stations, construction permits, TV6s, and one of the most recent additions or updates to the code is the ability to exclude just the Auction 83 translator applications. It also requires you to input a grid size and the type of low power service that you're analyzing. For this case, for now, just use the 100-watt option. There's some other option that's a remnant of the old code still in there. And then the outputs that the tool provides is basically a channel summary. It also gives you information about the inputs you put into the tool. It gives you a summary of the channels available and the points within those channels available, and then a channel-by-channel list of all the available low-power locations. It's a graphical representation. And it's these individual channel point combinations that dictate where FM translators may or may not be processed, in particular the spectrum limited markets. So these points within each of these grids, we're referring to these points as, we'll call them the sacred LPFM points. Okay, so this is just an example of the output from the grid tool. So this is the channel summary. And I apologize if it's difficult to see, but the video and presentation will be available on the web if you can't see them now well. But the top basically includes all the inputs. In this example, I used Dayton, Ohio. This is the actual study run for Dayton, Ohio in March 2012. The top includes all the inputs that were entered, the city, the coordinates, the protection options that you selected. And at the bottom, you have a summary of the channels available and the number of points available for each of these channels. So for this particular grid, 30 by 30 grid centered at Dayton, Ohio, it gives you the summary analysis of every channel and how many points are available for each of these channels. Just a little background, for the 30 by 30 grids, the tool actually studies 31 by 31 points, so a total of 961 points. The 20 by 20 grids, it studies 21 by 21 points for a total of 441. So here in this example, you see no channels available between 200 and 246, and there are indeed some points on channels available from 247 and above. So now we're going to jump to the detailed result for channel 262. And the details of this particular example are going to be very important when we get into how you use this to show a translator can work in particularly a spectrum limited market. So here, this is the channel 262 result for Dayton, Ohio. And you see very similar output on the left side and the right side. This represents the least preclusive and most preclusive sighting for LPFMs on the same channel within the grid. This is not particularly relevant for the translator analysis that's going to be needed to keep these applications alive. It's a remnant of the original code. Just think of it as a bonus. But what you need to know is that all dashes and all O's within the grid represent a point where an LPFM could be added within this grid. And therefore, these are all the points that must not be precluded by FM translator applications in and around this particular market. At the bottom of the page, there's another bonus here for you. It's another remnant. It's just detailed coordinate locations of all the O's on the map. So each point on this grid is numbered, starting with 1 at the lower right-hand corner running north. So this just gives you details of where each of these O's could be located. And dashes and O's represent all of the possible low power locations that a single low power could be located. The O's actually represent just, and again, this isn't for the translator purposes, just so you know whether they're, the O's represent the low powers that could coexist on the same channel within the same grid together. So just for some background there. Okay, so here again, we have, in this particular example, we have the definition of all the sacred LPFM points on channel 262 in Dayton, Ohio. If there were points available on other channels, there would be a similar grid showing you all of these available points. Okay, so jumping away from the grid tool for a second, this is a tentative timeline for processing the various translator applications that we have in front of us. Basically, right now we have roughly 6,500 remaining translator short forms that were filed in Auction 83. We're breaking them down into 3 basic categories: those that are in Spectrum limited markets, those that are in Spectrum available markets only, and all other applications outside of all markets, which we're considering rural. And it's actually the rural market applications that is the largest category. And so basically what we're looking to do is trying to figure out the best way to work through the remaining applications. So we expect the CAP compliance process will have to come first, hopefully in summer 2012, followed by dealing with non-Spectrum limited singletons, Spectrum limited non-preclusion showings, non-Spectrum limited MX settlements, Spectrum limited singletons, MX settlements, getting to the remaining singletons hopefully in spring of 2013, and then the auction and the non-comparative process spring, summer of next year. I cannot stress enough, and you can't see it on the slide, the word tentative on the slide. All of these dates could change, and there's all kinds of, I'll say, external forces that could affect these dates. So, this is a schedule we'd love to stick to, and if I can sit here next year and say we stuck to it, that would be great success. And hopefully, we will stick as close to it as possible. All the things on this timeline that I'm going to talk about in a second here, and Peter mentioned this, every single one of these discrete groups of applications that we're going to deal with in the pending applications, they're going to be dealt with in a separate public notice. There's going to be a public notice that's, that spells out, now's the time for CAP compliance, now's the time to file your long form for this group of short forms that are singletons. And each one will have, a discrete filing opportunity and specific details spelled out in the public notices, hopefully spelling out much of what I've discussed later today, and maybe additional details that become more clear as time goes on. Okay, so I'm going to jump out of order in the process here and get first into the non-preclusion showing studies in Spectrum limited markets. I'm doing this out of order because the non-preclusion showings are probably some of the most onerous filings that are going to be required of the translators to continue processing. So as you know, one of the most significant changes the Commission made from when it released the further notice in 2011 till the 4th report and order was to allow translators in Spectrum limited markets to be processed. So they've shifted these from dismissal markets to Spectrum limited markets. So the original proposal was to dismiss all of these. And now, for translators in these Spectrum limited markets to be processed, they must submit a successful non-preclusion showing. And that showing has 2 main parts, potentially. First part is protecting any LPFM grid channel point combinations. These are the sacred points I discussed earlier. The second part, just for those applications that are within the top 50 Spectrum limited markets, is the special top 50 Spectrum limited market test. And that's for those folks that are outside the confines of the grid for that market. Anything that can affect a Spectrum limited grid point is considered to be inside a Spectrum limited market. Okay? So any translator application within 39 kilometers of a Spectrum limited grid and or within the Spectrum Limited Top 50 Arbitron market must submit a non-preclusion showing. Okay, so you might be asking, where do we get this 39-kilometer distance? 39 kilometers is the maximum distance specified in 73807, the low-power rules, for low powers to protect co-channel FM translators. So this effectively defines the areas in which translators must make a showing to protect grid points. And then you also have those areas of Arbitron markets that are beyond this buffer area we're referring to. So presumably we'd have a public notice announcing a 30-day filing opportunity for people to submit these non-preclusion showings that have applications in these particular markets. We anticipate amendments to short forms would be permitted, and those amendments would have to be minor amendments. And hopefully this will be in fall of 2012 sometime. All right, so let's talk about specific examples here. Since those of you in the room can't see the title, this is actually the Atlanta market, and this is intended to show scenarios for non-preclusion showings in Spectrum Limited markets. Just to describe what you're seeing here, the Arbitron market as defined, Arbitron fall of 2011, are the red counties. The 30 by 30 grid centered around Atlanta is the black rectangle with Atlanta near the top of it. The 39-kilometer buffer around the grid is represented by the blue contour kind of surrounding the grid. And in this case, we've entered 5 examples of FM translator site proposals and where they fall. So Site A within the grid, Site B is outside the grid but inside the 39-kilometer buffer. Site C is outside the buffer but inside the Arbitron market. Site D outside the buffer and outside the Arbitron market. And Site E is outside the market, Arbitron market, but inside the buffer. So we talked earlier about these 2 tests. So here are the 2 tests that apply to these various points. Test 1, which is the test protecting the points within the grid. Any translators in sites A, B, and E, and here we're talking specifically about a top 50 Spectrum Limited market. Sites A, B, and E would have to satisfy Test 1. I'm going to get into those details in 1 second. And then Test 2, which is the top 50 Spectrum Limited test, the out-of-grid test, that would have to be performed by sites B and C. B is outside the grid but inside the buffer, and C is outside the grid and inside the Arbitron market. And then Site D is the one example on this page that does not have to submit any type of non-preclusion showing. And keep in mind, this example and other examples I'm going to show you later assumes there are no other nearby markets, and that's an important assumption. So in this case, I'm assuming Atlanta is just kind of off by its own, and there are no other markets that potentially affect these sites A through E. This is a particularly important distinction if you're looking at applications in the Northeast Corridor, parts of Florida, Southern California, where some of these markets and or their buffers will overlap. So in those cases, if you're within multiple buffers, you're potentially protecting grid points within multiple markets. Okay, so test 1. So we're going back to the grid tool now. So in order to run test 1 for these locations A, B, and E, you would run the grid tool centered in the market. You'd want to use the city center coordinates from the Excel file that was provided in the zip package. Select your protection options. In this case, we're looking at a Spectrum Limited market. So the grid tool is run with what I'll refer to as more permissive LPFM protection options. So it will permit the allocation of more LPFM stations within this grid. And this is directly relating to what the Commission has said in the 4th report and order. So in this case, these options that are highlighted in red on the screen are the most important ones to toggle as not protected. So everything is protected except for, from the top in red, second adjacent channel stations, third adjacent channel stations, IF channel stations, and Auction 83 FM translator application records. So all of those things would be not protected when adding these LPFM channel grid point combinations. Some other details. Make sure you use I already mentioned the city and state. Use the March 2012 data file, because we're all basing this at the same assumptions that the Commission made in releasing the Appendix A and B. You always use the 30 by 30 grid unless Appendix B indicates that that market was decided using a 20 by 20 grid, and you use the LPFM 100 watt at 30 meter assumption. Okay, so for points A, B, and E, since, and one apology here, the map is of Atlanta, the output here is for Dayton. For simplicity's sake, I just merged the two, but replace it with your city, USA, and both of them, and you'll be fine. Okay, so for points A, B, and E, here's another important note. Since this is a spectrum limited market, and since within these grids, the low powers were allotted only protecting co- and first adjacent stations, translators that are submitting these non-preclusion showings are only concerned with these points that are on a co- and first adjacent channel. Okay, so in this case, you see from the summary, the channels 221 and 245 on the summary page have no points available in the grid. So if this were your market and you had a translator on those channels between 221 and 245, you're in the clear, because there's nothing on a co-channel or first adjacent channel to you of a sacred LPFM point in that grid. So that's the easy example. So the more difficult example is, let's say you actually have a proposal on channel 262. So usually when you're looking at site-specific protections, it will mean selecting the closest point on the specific channel map to ensure that a low-power FM at any point in that grid will not be short to your translator proposal under 73807. Okay? So translator at Site A, on this example, and Site A comes from the original Atlanta map, may not be closer to any LPFM point within the grid that the 807 spacing required for a low-power FM at that point to protect that translator at Site A. So it's unlike what we normally do, where you're usually protecting something. You are ensuring that low powers within this sacred group of points will properly protect your translator within this market. Okay, so it's not about you protecting them. It's about these points, these low power points, being able to protect the translator. So if a translator can show no preclusion, so in this example, if this Site A were at least the 807 distance from any and all of these points, you satisfy the non-preclusion test on channel 262. So that's test one. I'm suspecting from the looks in the audience there are going to be questions on that at the end, but hopefully it's clear. Okay, so test two. Test two, remember, this is for locations B and C. These are points within the market that are not within the grid, but they're still within the confines of the Arbitron market. First of all, it's important to note that while the grid tool was not designed for this purpose, it can certainly be used for this test. So what you would do is you would use the same protection options you use for the grid analysis for that market, but instead of using the city center coordinates for that particular market, you would use the site you want to propose for that translator. And again, you're not concerned with, in this case, you're not concerned with all the channel summary or all the total points within each grid. You're really only concerned about the number of channels with a point available at the very center of each of these grids. So let me expand on that a little. So basically, the test is that the translator must show that at this point there are either 0 available low powers that could be allotted before you even consider the translator in the mix, or considering that translator being added at this location, there's at least one additional low power that could be added at this point. So it's effectively a no low power or one or more low power available test. So you can use the grid tool to run this analysis, and rather than relying on all of the points within each grid, you would simply be looking at the center point within each available channel to see if there's indeed a dash or an O at that center point for low power availability. Okay, and since there are very limited options in many of these top 50 markets, the Commission has spelled out that there should be a first-come, first-served process for these, since we expect some folks may be scrambling. So whenever we do open this window, we would expect to get many filings on the first day. And if you want to have the best opportunity to take advantage of these limited opportunities, file early and file often. So just a little summary here of the non-preclusion showings in Spectrum limited markets. Test 1, you're running the grid tool at the city center coordinates. If your proposed translator, if it will preclude the use of any of these LPFM channel point combinations, the translator cannot be processed. Test 2, only for those translators within the Arbitron market, of the top 50 market, and outside the grid. The applicant must show either 0 available LPFM channels, ignoring their own proposal, or at least one remaining LPFM channel protecting your own proposal. Something, and I mentioned this before, be careful of sites that are within multiple buffers. Many of these markets are very close together, so you may have a translator that actually falls within 2 or possibly even 3 buffers. And during the time you're submitting these showings, the anti-collusion rules will apply, so you're not able to talk to your competitor applicants in these same markets. Okay, now jumping to Singletons and non-Spectrum limited markets. We're going back in time a little bit in the timeline. These are a little easier to deal with. This is going to be the first expected long-form filing opportunity. It will include rural applications, and only those applications that are in Spectrum available markets are those Spectrum available market buffers. So right now that's about 2/3 of the remaining applications we have in front of us. We expect the Singleton public notice will hopefully come out this fall sometime. It will identify short-form singletons and provide a 30 to 60-day opportunity to file your long forms. Minor mods are going to be permitted when you compare the short form to the long form. Within the Spectrum available market, the Commission has said in the order that since these applications were considered in the analysis of that market, a same site, same channel proposal will be okay to process, assuming you are only within a Spectrum available market. Any types of changes in these Spectrum available markets, including site or channels, may require a non-preclusion showing. The public notice we're going to be putting out is going to be very similar to those public notices we put out in 2003 and 2008 that invited long forms at those times. If you're not familiar with it, the Audio Division website, you can look at the history there and find them in the summer of 03 and 08. Again, file early. We generally handle these forms in the order in which they're filed, and they also get rights as of the date they file. So the earlier you file, the earlier we get to pick you up, and the more protection you will likely have. And this is the first time we've been talking about acceptability of these proposals. When you're filing your long form, that's the first time that your proposal is going to be studied for acceptability. And this actually reminds me of one of the questions I received from AFC earlier, and that was a question about somebody's short form now no longer being viable because a change of the primary station that they had specified. We generally do not care about acceptability issues until you've actually submitted your long form. So just keep in mind that you also need to comply with the regular translator protection rules and interference rules. So important to know. And another important point is any modification within a buffer or into a buffer zone or into a top 50 spectrum limited market will be required to submit a non-preclusion showing. So if you weren't in any of these markets and with your long form you decide to move into one, you've just potentially increased your filing burden on yourself. Okay, so Singletons spectrum limited markets, just a little graphic here to give you some examples of things that would be included and wouldn't be included in such a public notice. So here we have the Sarasota-Bradenton spectrum available market to the north in yellow, and the Fort Myers-Naples spectrum limited market to the south. The grids, these are 20 by 20 grids for these markets, are indicated in black in the center, and the red is the spectrum available buffer, the 39-kilometer buffer around Sarasota, and the blue is spectrum limited buffer around Fort Myers. For the first Singleton public notice, we will only include those applications not in spectrum limited market buffers or those within top 50 market arbitron areas. So here we have Site A. It's within both buffers. Since it's in the spectrum limited buffer, would not be included in the public notice. Site B only in the spectrum available buffer would, and Site C outside all buffers in all markets would also be included. And again, here, this example, it's just showing you these two markets in a vacuum. Those of you that know Florida know Tampa's just to the north, and there are other markets around that could potentially affect how these site-specific issues would play out. Okay, so we're still talking about Singletons and non-spectrum limited markets. Assuming no site or channel changes, translator proposals in these markets are okay to process. However, much like non-preclusion showings in spectrum limited markets, applications proposing changes in spectrum available markets must show they don't preclude the existing LPFM channel point combinations. So again, you want to use the grid tool, running it at to make these showings. Run it at the city center coordinates with the following protection options. And here, since we're talking about a spectrum available market, they're much less permissive LPFM allocation standards. So in this case, everything is protected: CO, first, second, IF, TV6, auction 83, everything with the exception of third adjacent channel, of course. So that would assess the LPFM points using the appropriate protection options. And then a similar analysis would follow, as I spelled out for you in the Atlanta example, except translators in a spectrum available market must not preclude low powers on CO, first, second, or IF channels. So you're potentially looking at a smaller universe of points that have to be not precluded, but you have more channel options that you have to concern yourself with. So basically, these non-preclusion showings are effectively the same type of analysis in spectrum available and spectrum limited markets. You just have different protection options when allocating the sacred points, and different adjacencies that the translator has to concern themselves with when making sure they don't preclude those points. Okay, now jumping to mutually exclusive groups in non-spectrum limited markets. We're hoping to release this public notice in, I'll say, early winter of 2012. It would include applications in spectrum available markets and non-Appendix A markets. It would not include any groups that contain spectrum-limited market applications. And that's primarily because we expect these spectrum-limited folks are going to be kind of behind everybody else in having to have submitted their non-preclusion showings. So it's the same basic category of applications from the first Singleton public notice, except these are the MX ones. Public notice would identify all of the discrete groups, provide an opportunity to file amendments or settlements. This will be the first exemption from the anti-collusion rule. Settlements will be limited to expenses. Minor mods will be permitted. Groups that fail to eliminate mutual exclusivity would then proceed to the MX resolution process, and I'll touch on that. Any remaining mixed NCE commercial groups will have the NCE applications dismissed. This is an important distinction, and it brings up another issue, and that's the possibility of NCE applicants to be able to convert their applications to commercial proposals. That we've had previous situations where we've had groups of applicants that had filed before the final auction rules were adopted, and in those cases the Commission has allowed NCEs in these mixed groups to amend their proposals to specify commercial operation. We're well aware of this issue, but we have to wait and see if the Commission is going to provide similar relief for these translator applicants that might find themselves in mixed groups. We also expect a similar public notice dealing with any groups involving any applications within Spectrum limited markets, and that would be in later winter, I'll say winter 2013, but January, February 2013, not November, December 2013. Okay, so just moving through the remaining groups of applications, Singletons and Spectrum limited markets. We would expect to identify these and provide a filing opportunity in early winter. Again, it would be a 30 to 60-day filing opportunity. Minor mods would be permitted, and that would be comparing the original short form to the long form, because remember, some of these folks may have submitted non-preclusion showings. I take it back. All of these folks will have submitted non-preclusion showings. Any changes to the engineering from the non-preclusion showing time to the long form would require an additional non-preclusion showing, unless, of course, you're just moving completely out of the market or the area of concern. Again, file early, because your opportunities may be limited by when you file and other folks filing in surrounding areas. And again, these types of long form proposals must be acceptable. For the MX resolution process, just this is, we're talking fairly distant future here, but just touching briefly on this, mixed groups that remain will dismiss any remaining NCE applications in those mixed groups, as I mentioned earlier. Pure commercial groups will be sent to auction. The only FM translator auction up until now has been auction 88, which contained all of one group. We're hoping to have the first real FM translator auction in 2013, but since there is a service-wide settlement opportunity, it remains to be seen how many groups will survive to the auction. And then non-commercial groups will be decided using the non-commercial comparative criteria, and we expect there's going to have to be an additional supplement opportunity for those folks to submit their comparative showings. Okay, talking just a couple more slides, talking about translator minor mod processing. A lot of folks are curious about what things we are processing and what things we can't. Right now, any mods that are making intra-market modifications, that is modifications within markets, are okay. Moving into Spectrum available markets can be processed. And the one main restriction we have right now is moving into Spectrum limited markets requires a non-preclusion showing. And since we do not have OMB or PRA approval to collect that information, we can't ask anybody to submit it, but if they want to volunteer it, that's fine too. Off the record. Okay, and the last caveat there, should any modification practices become problematic, we may temporarily freeze any minor mods for translators. And I know everybody wants everything to be definite, but basically, we haven't seen problematic practices where, significant issues have been arising where low power points have been taken away from folks. But if we see repeated issues involving that issue, repeated concerns involving that issue, we may have to take steps to prevent further eradication of the sacred LPFM points until we have a low power window. Okay. The rural cap compliant Singleton PN. This is a very small group of the remaining 6,500 applications, and it's the only translator processing that can begin before we have the PRA approvals for the cap collections and for the non-preclusion showings. This could happen at any time. Honestly, I've been waiting to hear from somebody that may be voluntarily coming and apply in compliance with the cap. But basically, it would be a public notice announcing a long-form filing opportunity for singletons that are outside all market areas that are only for those applicants that currently comply with the nationwide cap. So just right now, the total number of those applications is somewhere around 120 such singletons. If these couple of applicants come into compliance, there may be several dozen more added to that first singleton public notice. And we're just trying to do as many of these things that we can now that don't require this PRA approval. So if we can get that public notice out soon, that will be great. And these applicants, it will be in the public notice, but any such applicants that move into a market or buffer area will prevent further processing of the long form because we would be required to get a non-preclusion showing from them. Okay. Just to recap, use the LPFM grid tool to assess the preclusive impact of translators within 39 kilometer of any market grid. Translator applicants cannot preclude any of these available LPFM channel point combinations. The top 50 spectrum limited market test is for those out of grid in Arbitron market applications. Expect the first public notices announcing significant filing opportunities this summer. Hopefully those will be things involving the first real batch of singletons and also cap compliance process. Okay, with that, I would like to see if we have any questions that I can field immediately. And
I'll warm you up with a few.
Okay. Softballs, please.
Okay. This is from our vast internet audience. Whoops. Jim, I heard you talk about the non-preclusion test in spectrum limited markets as requiring co- and first adjacent channel showings. What about second adjacent showings in spectrum limited markets?
Okay, so in spectrum limited markets, the sacred LPFM points are allotted only protecting co- and first adjacent stations. So a low power at any of these points cannot be short to an FM translator under 807 in those examples. So if I'm understanding the question correctly,
I think the question is, do they need to, when you look at the LPFM to translator spacing for preclusion purposes, do they need to take into account second adjacent spacing requirements in a spectrum limited market?
Right, and the short answer is no.
No, right.
Yes.
Okay, a related question. If my concern is only with a first adjacent channel where the maximum distance separation is 28 kilometers, not the 39, do I still have to make a preclusion showing if I'm more than 28 but less than 39 kilometers away?
Yes, and this will be spelled out in the public notices, but for simplicity's sake, we're going to require anybody within this 39-kilometer buffer of the entire grid to submit a showing. Now, in that example, the showing should be a very easy one to make.
Right.
Because they're obviously going to be compliant with 807.
Okay, and then I think the answer is clear in this, but I'll ask it anyway. What about translators that operate less than 13.3 kilometers? I guess that's the distance to the 60 dBU contour. So in a different class with a different distance separation requirement,
right.
Am I still bound by the 39-kilometer rule for preclusion showings?
The short answer is yes, and for those that don't understand the question, low power protections to FM translators. Basically, for those purposes, translators are broken into 3 classes, and the classes are defined by the distance to the translator's 60 dBu contour. So depending on, basically the size of the FM translator, that dictates the spacings that the low powers must meet with respect to those particular translators. So assuming you are a translator that only has a 6 kilometer 60 dBu contour, you fit into the smallest spacing requirement under 807 protections between low powers and FM translators. So it would, by having a smaller translator, you make it easier to satisfy the non-preclusion test in that example.
Okay. Here, for a short form FM translator application that is close to the edge of the geographic border of a spectrum limited market, is it acceptable to amend the coordinates on the long form to move out of that market?
Absolutely. And we would expect people will do this. Or for that matter, when you have a amendment opportunity to submit your non-preclusion showing, you could also amend the site out of the buffer, out of the arbitron market, so as to eliminate the need to actually have a showing with your application. I mean, that would effectively be your showing.
Okay. I always kid Jim about he's always poaching on my legal territory, so I'll ask you a legal question. Will embedded markets be considered separate markets for cap purposes? No.
I'm trying to remember. I apologize because I really focused on the technical aspects of this.
That's not fair. I'll answer it.
Okay, that'd be helpful.
The markets, we don't look at embedded markets. It's all our calculations were based on the major market classifications, which subsume the embedded markets, and that's clear when you look at Appendix A of the order. So you wouldn't get to keep separate applications in separate embedded markets within a major market.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to. Here's one that I will take. I have 5 applications in a spectrum available market. Can I process all 5? No. The market cap is not related to the spectrum limited and spectrum
Correct.
Available designations. Here's a concern about when opening these windows. Are we concerned about servers going down, especially when we're using first come, first serve filing rules?
Right, and I think I should. That question brings up an important issue. Our first come, first serve rules, as we've always applied them, it's not a, we don't have a cutoff window every minute. It's a day by day assessment. So everybody filed on the first day, potentially has the ability to bump into one another. So we understand there may be conflicts like that could occur. I will go out on a limb and say we are not concerned about servers in this particular example. I mean, at the worst, we're expecting to have 1,500 to 2,000 filers, absolute worst case, in one of these public notices. When we had the long form filing opportunity in 2003, if I remember correctly, we identified something like 4,300 or 4,500 singleton short forms, and we invited long forms for those. We got something like 3,700 or 3,800. We had no problems during that window. We have improved servers since all of these problems have happened, and I think the improved servers in combination with the fact that we're talking about a relatively low number of filings, there should not be any concerns. And as always, if by any chance there is some kind of issue, I think the Commission has made it pretty clear that if these problems, prevent folks from filing in a timely fashion, we can extend the window.
Are any TV6 facilities to be protected other than full service, so LPTV and stations, and TV translator stations on Channel 6?
I believe the answer is yes. And yes, the answer is yes.
I guess technically the question here is, does the FCC program protect secondary Channel 6 stations?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
And there's actually a specific protection option on the grid tool for that.
Okay. I think we got a disappointing answer on the next question. Is it possible to obtain Arbitron market boundary files from the FCC? If not, can you provide a source?
Well, we don't have anything that we can make publicly available, and quite frankly, we've been assembling these market definitions manually, but I would recommend contacting Arbitron for that kind of assistance.
Okay.
Well, I mean, we use MapInfo, and it's a quite capable tool to build these Arbitron markets.
Okay, here's a question that I'm the guilty party on. What about the processing of FM translator applications that were filed prior to 2001 and were supplemented in the July 2001 window and remain pending? Jim has been on my case for quite some time to clean up this little backlog. It's a short list, but we will get them hopefully knocked out in the next couple months.
He's been busy.
But that's on my list, not on Jim's. Will FCC suspend reasonable and prudent cost limitations during the FM translator MX settlement process? I think the answer to that is that the order says no.
Right. The assumption is the answer will be no.
Now, I think there's language in there's certainly nothing in the order to suggest a waiver of that limitation.
Agreed, yes.
We're expecting a lot of engineering settlements.
Yeah, right. Yes, but yeah, right. Engineering settlements, sure, but not for above expenses. Well, there's a big assumption on this question. Assuming the tentative timeline for the FM translator application processing is correct, do you expect the LPFM filing window to take place in the summer of 2013 at the earliest?
You're letting me answer that one?
Yeah, sure.
Right. Well, there are a lot of things that need to happen before the LPFM window can be opened. First and foremost, the Commission has to adopt final technical standards for the LPFM service. So until we have those final rules, we can't even begin to talk about a low-power window. But that said, this is a priority of the Commission to open a low-power window. Some low-power advocates have asked for plenty of time between technical rule finality and the opening of that window, so they can get their tentative applicants together. So I think at the absolute earliest we would be talking spring 2013. I think that's probably a bit optimistic. So spring summer 2013 is a possibility.
Okay, here's a question from a new licensee of a Class A NCE station that has terrain issues and would love to get a new translator to serve their communities. When can we expect a window for new translator applications?
The expectation would be after we complete the processing of these FM translator applications, which clearly has to happen first, and then after we have a low-power FM window, that is at the point which we would be able to entertain the possibility of opening yet another FM translator window. But I expect we're done with these 6500. This will be a distant memory, and we'll be through much of the low power applications from the next low power window. So not before 2014.
Right. And that depends in part on other potential services, for example, another full power NCE window, something like that. Okay, in a spectrum limited market, where the market extends beyond the grid, does the 39-kilometer buffer extend to the geographic borders of the Arbitron market? So would you push it out past 39 kilometers?
Right. The only time Arbitron markets extending beyond the 39-kilometer buffer is an issue is if we're talking about a top 50 spectrum limited market. So only in the top 50 spectrum limited markets where the Arbitron extends beyond that buffer do those applicants within that extension of the Arbitron area need to submit a non-preclusion showing. So all other situations, if it's a non-top 50 market or if it's a non-spectrum limited market, if you're within the Arbitron confines but beyond the buffer, it's not a concern. You don't need to submit a showing.
Okay, I'll just read it because I'm not sure it's really exactly relevant to what we've been going over here. Will owners, this is the subject line is current translators, will owners of more than one translator in a market be required to turn in all but one translator license?
No.
No, why not? That's. If an applicant filed multiple translator applications in a rural market, will the FCC require the applicant to choose one application to be processed?
Right. So the application limits, the caps as they currently stand, are only applicable, particularly the one per customer per market cap, is only applicable to those 156 markets identified in Appendix A. So if you're not talking about one of those 156 markets, you're not restricted but to the one per market limitation.
Well, actually what we said was that we would handle it on a case-by-case basis.
Yes, and there may be a few examples where there are multiples in non-top 156 markets that would be of concern, but there are very few markets. By definition, all markets beyond 150 that had more than 4 applications were included in the 156. So those 6 markets were chosen because they had multiple applications in those markets. So there are very few markets that have multiple apps in them.
Right. It's also the case that this issue remains before the Commission with a petition for reconsideration.
Yes.
So the last word on that is yet to be written. I think you touched on this, but will applicants with more than one pending application in a spectrum limited market be allowed to amend some of their short form applications to move them outside the market for the purpose of meeting the market cap?
Right. The short answer is no. The way the Commission has spelled it out, it's still on recon, but the cap process would play out first, and applicants would have to select their applications to comply with the cap implementation before any of these other showings occur. So we'd have a cap public notice. We'd ask people to voluntarily comply with the cap. Those that didn't, we would go ahead and take the actions for them the way the Commission has indicated we should do so, which is based on file number. And then whatever's remaining are the applications of which they would have to potentially submit non-preclusion showing. So by definition, at the end of the cap process, they would only have one left in each of the 156 markets.
Right. And if they don't do it voluntarily, we will dismiss the latter filed
Yes.
application. Okay, I think you've covered this one too. If a rural area translator application filed by a commercial operator is MX'd to just one other application which was filed by a non-commercial applicant, will the non-com application be dismissed?
Right, and that's certainly a possibility, but the other possibility is that the Commission provides an amendment opportunity for these NCE applicants that are going to receive this fate and give them the opportunity to potentially convert to commercial, and in that case then those two could go to auction.
Okay. I think this is a question we've talked about. I think there's a better formulation in this sheet. It has to do with the displacement. A 2003 translator short form application was proposed on a frequency now blocked by a station that changed its community of license. May I apply for a displacement waiver, meaning propose a non-adjacent channel?
Right, and we received this question and another similar question from AFC, and the other question that we received was, would we entertain Mattoon waivers for long forms that are filing filing their applications now? And the assumption is any such waiver requests are going to face a very high hurdle, and that we're going to require these applicants to submit minor modifications. The Mattoon waiver, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, involved an existing operating FM translator that wanted to move its station more than the distance allowed by the minor change limitations. And the Bureau found there were certain situations where it justified making this significant move. By definition, none of these applicants that are going to be filing long forms could satisfy the test because they are not indeed operating translators. So the expectation is, while I can't say we won't take waivers, clearly there's going to be a very high hurdle to justify waivers in these cases.
Must a long form applicant have site assurance of site availability?
That's a legal question, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yes, the answer is yes. We've also covered this. Are all the 156 market in Appendix A considered separate markets? There were embedded markets that were in that list, but we looked to the main market.
Are we answering the site availability question?
Yes. By all means, have site assurance.
Okay.
Early and often. Will presentation or PowerPoint be available after the session? If so, where on the web?
Okay, I know the video is going to be available, Donna said, the same site that's announced in the news release, is that correct? And is the presentation also there? Okay, so both are available at the same site where the news release announced you could watch the video from. There's an archive section, I think, in there. It's fairly easy to navigate.
What will we do if two MX translator applicants each file a successful preclusion study on the same day, but they both are pointing to the same available low power channel? So are we going to will they need to work that out during the settlement period, or?
Right, I think they would have to be deemed mutually exclusive, and then they'd be put into that processing chute.
Okay, we've talked about suspending the anti-collusion. Well, I know we haven't. We talked about would it be reasonable to request a suspension of the anti-collusion rules starting immediately, since there will be a settlement process? I'll take that one. I think the fair reading of the order is that the cap dismissal process will happen with the anti-collusion rules in effect. If an applicant has pending apps in 2 separate markets embedded in a third, top 50, must the applicant choose only one to process? Yes. For overlapping markets where an area is in 2 arbitron markets, for example, market 4 and 26, which market do you consider it?
Okay, so I'm assuming we're not talking about the cap. Because
I'm guessing
when we're talking about the cap, we're talking about the confines of the arbitron market. So the only way you can be in 2 markets at the same time is by looking at the buffer.
Right.
And so, is this talking about a?
I'm thinking it is a buffer question.
Right. So, any spectrum limited market in which you're within the buffer, you have to, your non-preclusion showing has to not preclude points in any of those grids. So as long as the buffer, pulls you into, the confines of its limits, you're basically engaged in that market. So there are instances, I believe, where there's actually points where 3 buffers could envelop one particular point. So you don't pick one or the other. You have to show that you're not precluding points in all of the available grids in which you are located in the buffer.
Are non-preclusion showings required for an intramarket mod by a authorized translator station in a spectrum limited market?
No. Intra-market, correct?
Intra, right.
They are not required.
Is there any way other than distance calculations to determine if translator site is fully spaced to all low power channel point combinations? For fairness to the people viewing from home.
Sorry about that. Is there any way, the grid tool itself I don't think provides this ability, is there any way to determine if a translator, proposed translator site is short-spaced to any sacred LPFM grid location on any specific channel?
I think you're asking, is there any automated way to do that?
That's exactly what I'm asking.
No.
But there may be, there could be multitudinous LPFM locations, grid locations that you have to do those manual calculations to, and you're going to tell me yes, right?
There could be, but typically it comes down to the nearest point on the most relevant channel or channels. So, really, I would think in most cases you're looking at 3 points or 6 or 7 points, because you're always concerned with the nearest sacred point for any of the relevant channels. And we certainly did not, this whole process has kind of evolved, and quite frankly, the grid tool has, it started having very minimal requirements imposed on it, and we kept kind of building on it, and so we have not built any automated tool to do this. I think we can use the grid tool in a fashion to easily assess what markets there are issues and what markets there aren't, just by taking before and after pictures. But I know that there are folks out there that are looking to use what we've done with the grid tool and build their own tools around it to try and automate the process as much as possible.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Oh, Peter.
All right. I knew I'd lose control of this.
Is there any way at this time to find out whether a given translator application is filed as a commercial or non-commercial outside the FCC?
Not yet. Obviously the individual applicants know, but the information about the 175s has not, to my knowledge, has not been released to the public.
No, the question was, will it be released before the cap process? And I believe the answer to that is no, that this goes to sort of the comparative rights of all the applicants, and I don't think we would want to do something to disturb that situation. As Jim said, the Commission will need to give us some guidance as to whether or not amendments will be permitted, and I would anticipate that if that happens, applicants, will be given one opportunity to do that.
I'm thinking just when making cap decisions, if one has a non-commercial application, if all MX applications are non-commercials, that's an entirely different situation than the situation where all of them are commercials, and the application is owned by a nonprofit entity.
So will that guidance be given ahead of the cap selection?
Right.
That's fair. We'll certainly try to do that. I understand your concern. While I'm here.
Okay. Any other questions? And all right, Peter's got.
I've got
1 or 2 or 7 more.
Not sure there's much here that we haven't covered, but let's see. Can a DU study be used to establish that one translator application is not MX to a second translator application?
That's actually a good question. We haven't been down this path yet, and I think it's something that we're certainly open to consider. I'd like to hear more from folks on that, quite frankly, because we have not been down that path yet. But I think 1204 provides this ability for translator to other station protection, so I don't know why we wouldn't allow 2 translators to submit such a showing to prevent mutual exclusivity. I would imagine that would be something that we would deal with at the short form settlement opportunity. So you know how to reach me if you want to provide your input on that subject.
All right, here's a question. I guess more a request that we consider lifting the anti-collusion rule prior to the settlement window. And I think we've answered that it's at this point that's not what the Commission has said. I'm sorry, Rob Gates is not here for this one. Is there any way to speed up license to cover applications for FM translators? I didn't know we had any problem with license to cover. Okay, this is odd, but okay, this is sort of outside the scope. Allowing existing translators to change from translator to LPFM. I guess the answer to that is we don't have rules to do that.
Correct. Yes, and I meant to give a little plug for Rob Gates. As most of you know, Rob and Larry both do the majority of the FM translator processing, and Rob was so looking forward to this presentation. He went on a cruise with his family this week, so he gets to miss this.
Okay, I think you covered this, but just to reinforce, does the move of an existing translator into a Spectrum available market for the first time into the grid require a non-preclusion study?
I assume this is talking about a licensed translator filing a mod into a Spectrum available market?
Yes.
And the answer is that type of mod is currently permitted and will be processed.
Without a non-preclusion showing?
Correct.
Right. How do we know if a station has a reading for the blind subcarrier?
Um,
Want me to answer that one?
yeah, why don't you answer that one? No.
Okay, in the fifth report and order, the order part of that basically concluded that our current rule comported with what the LCRA told us to do with regard to third adjacent channel protection requirements for those stations with radio reading services. I don't know if a recon of that conclusion has been filed or not. But if not, then the current rule applies, and the current rule is based on those stations which appeared on a list that we prepared back in 2000. So that would be the universe of stations that would be entitled to third adjacent channel protection from a new low power station. But again, I just don't know whether there's a recon on that issue. Okay, if not, then I think that's a final rule. If Tom thinks it not, but.
Okay. So any other questions from the audience before? Oh, Laura?
No, I can do this.
If the minimum number of channel...
Wait.
Jim, if the minimum number of channel floors for the market aren't met with the auction 83 translators dismissed, or I'm sorry, rather, if the minimum number isn't met when all of the translators, the pending translators, are dismissed, what do you do? How are you going to handle that?
Right. The channel, you're referring to the channel floors that were
Right,
discussed in the
exactly.
fourth report and order. And basically, the channel floors were used to make distinctions as to how the particularly translators will be processed in those markets. While it's certainly, we're hopeful that those channel floors are ultimately met, there's no requirement, there's nothing that says if we don't get this many low powers in this market, something will happen, or it will turn into a pumpkin. It just, they were just floors that were used to make these distinctions as far as spectrum limited and spectrum available. And they were based on certain factors, number of non-commercials in many of these markets and other factors that influence those floors. But there's absolutely no requirement to get to that floor.
Well,
honestly, we just can't control that. We don't know in some of these markets if we'll even have any interest from low power advocates. So, we just take the applications. We don't require that they be filed in any particular areas.
Right. I mean, it just speaks to if the dismissal of the translator applications doesn't open up the LPFM availability, then why are those translator applications being dismissed? Which then follows this question: if the channel, a channel that's reflected in the ER&O is shown as available because of the dismissal of all of the the pending apps, but it couldn't be proposed at a specific translator site, then is it necessary to dismiss those applications?
That's a lot of questions in
Yeah,
one. But
it's a lot of questions.
Basically, okay, first things first, there will be another translator filing opportunity. So whatever folks don't get to pursue their applications now, either because of the cap or because of the non-preclusion showing, there will be another opportunity to file applications in the entire country. So this isn't the last translator opportunity. It's just we're deciding what to do with these to hopefully prevent the loss of ability to file low powers in these markets. As far as dismissing things that don't preclude low power points, I mean the whole standard is based on dismissing only those things that do preclude them, or only those things that don't make the proper showing to show that they don't preclude them. So, in theory, everybody who complies with the cap can keep all of their applications alive in all these markets. They just have to make the non-preclusion showing.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Okay. No further questions. Thank you all for coming. We appreciate it.